Hi, and welcome to Mrs. Long's video lesson on the Picture of Dorian Gray, chapter 9. So this chapter is set the following day after, so 2 days post Sibyl's death, and Basil has heard of Sibyl's death and he is incredibly concerned for his friend, and rushes to his side. And then we have the extreme contrast, as has been happening throughout the story, between Basil's response to Sibyl's death and Henry's response, and the way they both respond to Dorian. And then once that conversation has taken its course, it moves on to the portrait, and we see a very interesting exchange between Dorian and Basil in terms of the change or something interesting that they've noticed in the portrait. Okay, so Basil says to Dorian, I called last night and they told me you're at the opera. Of course, I knew it was impossible, because, you know, you've just heard of the death of your fiancé. You're going to marry this girl, so surely you wouldn't be out at the theatre. I passed a dreadful evening, half afraid that one tragedy might be followed by another. So there's the hint there that he thought Dorian might be so overcome with grief that he might even take his own life. Then he asks about Sibyl's mother. Did you go and see the girl's mother? They gave the address in the paper, but I was afraid of intruding upon sorrow that I could not lighten. Poor woman, what a state she must be in. Now, what we're seeing in Basil is the normal, well, what hopefully most of us can agree would be the normal reaction to hearing of the death of a young girl. You inquire about the family. Surely if Dorian was engaged to this girl, he would have some sort of responsibility to visit the mother, offer his concern and assistance in any way possibly. Of course, that none of that even crossed Dorian's mind. So Dorian says to Basil, my dear Basil, how do I know? And he's sipping pale yellow wine from a beautiful Venetian glass, looking bored. Don't talk about horrid subjects. If one doesn't talk about a thing, it's never happened. I may mention she was not the woman's only child. There is a son, a charming fellow, I believe. He's a sailor or something. It's kind of offhand reference to James Vane, who will become very important later on in the story. And so those of us who feel a sense of kinship to Basil would, even though we may have been horrified by Dorian's reaction in the previous chapter, his callousness has become even more apparent here. And so he says, you went to the opera while Sibyl Vane was lying dead in some sordid lodging. You can talk to me of other women being charming and of Patty singing before the girl you loved has even the quiet of a grave to sleep in. Why, man, there are horrors in store for that little white body of hers. And Dorian doesn't even want to hear about it. You must not tell me about these things. What is done is done. What is past is past. And Basil said, but it was only yesterday. What has the actual lapse of time got to do with it? It is only shallow people who require years to get rid of an emotion. Okay? We've heard before of Dorian and Henry's view, specifically Henry's view about shallow people who feel things more than superficial people. Very paradoxical. And perhaps just an easy way for Dorian to, remove himself from having to feel anything that he doesn't want to feel. I don't want to be at the mercy of my emotions. I want to use them, enjoy them, and dominate them. That's quite an important quote, because that's what Dorian does actually do. Dorian, this is horrible. You can imagine Basil's absolute shock and disbelief. Something has changed you completely. You look exactly the same wonderful boy who day to day used to come down to my studio to sit for his picture, but you were simple, natural, and affectionate. You were unspoiled. Now I don't know what has come over you. You talk as if you had no heart, no pity in you. It's all Harry's influence. I see that. And so he feels that it's Harry's fault that Dorian seems to be completely opposite to the young boy he knew. I owe a great deal to Harry, Basil. he said at last. More than I owe to you. You only taught me to be vain. Well, Dorian likes to blame his vanity on the portrait, and by default on Basil, who painted the portrait. But we know it's not Basil who planted the idea in Dorian that he was beautiful, and that was the only thing worth having. And Basil says, I'm punished for that, or shall be someday, which is lovely foreshadowing to his death as well. I want the Dorian Gray I used to paint, says Basil. And then Basil laughs and says, you've come too late. Yesterday when I heard that Sibyl Vane had killed herself, and Basil said, killed herself? Is there no doubt about that? He's got an expression of horror. How fearful. And he buries his face in his hands. No, said Dorian Gray, there's nothing fearful about it. It's one of the great romantic tragedies of the age. Now, when you hear Dorian and Lord Henry speak about death, Sibyl's death is a wonderful tragedy, you can almost see where they're coming from. But when you hear Dorian explain it to Basil, it makes you realize just how incongruous it is to what actually happened. Her death had all the pathetic uselessness of martyrdom, it's all its wasted beauty. But as I was saying, you must not think I have suffered. I suffered immensely, then it passed away. I cannot repeat an emotion. Yeah, he was upset for about 15 minutes. You come down to console me. That is charming of you. You found me consoled and you're furious. You're awfully unjust, Basil. I can't understand. I feel fine. Don't worry about me. To become the spectator of one's own life, as Harry says, is to escape the suffering of life. I was a schoolboy when you knew me. I'm a man now. I have new passions, new thoughts, new ideas. I'm different, but you must not like me less. I'm changed, but you must always be my friend. Of course, I'm very fond of Harry, but I know that you are better than he is. Don't leave me, Basil, and don't quarrel with me. I am what I am. There's nothing more to be said. So he says, I'm changed, I'm different, I've got new ideas, but I still want to be friends with you. He says, I know that you're better than Harry. It's almost like he wants to keep Basil around as a convenience. Perhaps deep down he knows that Basil is going to be a truer friend to him than Harry ever could be, although he then rejects that later on. Well, Dorian, says Basil at length, I won't speak to you again about this horrible thing. I trust only your name won't be mentioned. And Dorian hates the word inquest. There's something crude and vulgar. It's a reality he doesn't want to think about. They don't know my name. Only my Christian name she knew, and I'm quite sure she never mentioned to anybody. Invariably, she told them my name was Prince Charming. It was pretty of her. I should like to have something more of her than the memory of a few pathetic words and broken pathetic words and kisses. Now he moves on to the speaking of the painting. But before we move on to that aspect of the chapter, let's have a look at the incredible importance of, firstly, Sibyl not knowing Dorian's real name, so that he kind of becomes not just morally absolved of anything to do with her death, and emotionally he absolves himself, but in the eyes of the law, or practically, he doesn't have any link to her death. And of course, the name Prince Charming then comes back to haunt him when James Vane finds out that that's what he's called. And Basil asks if he can paint him again. Dorian says, I can never sit to you again. It's impossible. And Basil, of course, is really startled by this. Do you mean to say you don't like what I did? Where is it? Why have you pulled a screen in front of it? Let me look at it. And of course, at this point, Dorian realizes more than any other time, I think, that he is really afraid of somebody seeing the painting and seeing the change of the painting. Remember, he didn't tell Henry about it, and he obviously doesn't want Basil to see. So he rushes and he throws himself between Basil and the screen and says, if you try to look at it, on my word of honor, I'll never speak to you again. If you touch the screen, everything is over between us. Of course, he knows that that's hitting Basil where it hurts, because he knows that Basil it really values their friendship and their connection. So he's he's playing his trump card there by saying, I don't want you to see it, and if you do, then that's it for us. I'm going to end this video here because the last part of this chapter needs to be discussed all in one. So we will have a look at that in the next installment.